Hey there, this is Chad from Zombie Fight Shark, and today we are comparing free orchestral options for your DAW. There are four we're going to compare today: St. James Orchestra sound font, the Squidfont orchestral sound font, the VERSILLIAN Studios Chamber Orchestra or VSCO, and the Alpine project Kontakt library. And then there's a little bonus track thrown in where I've combined a few of these together. So let's take a listen to the music and we'll talk about what's what after it's over with. Okay, well, let's talk about it. First, just a little housekeeping stuff up at the top. So, why did I do this in Reason? I did it in Reason because Reason does not create multiple versions of whatever instrument you're using. If you do this in Ableton, whenever you import a sound font, it will create a new instrument and save it in your user settings. And I was just trying to avoid creating a whole bunch of instruments that I knew I already had. So that's why I use Reason. Reverb, I used Safe Reverb. It's a free reverb VST, and I'll put a link in the description if you're interested in it. It was used on everything except for the combo at the end. For that one, I used the TSAR one reverb because it was a special case. And if you're wondering why didn't I, there's one other free orchestra that I did not use here, the virtual playing orchestra, and I listened to some samples of it, and it just didn't sound very good to me. So I said, well, I got to draw a line somewhere, and that's where the line was. So let's go through it. First, St. James. Best thing about it, the thing I loved about it was the choir. Man, I thought that choir just sounded great. So it kind of took a key role in the piece that I wrote for it. So the sounds in it, they go from decent to great. Some of them they're usable for background, but they're not usable for foreground stuff. Some of them solid all the way through. There's not a ton of articulation options in the St. James Orchestra. There are some, but you don't get all your different articulations for every instrument. So that's something to be aware of. And I had a weird issue that it could be Reason related. It could be something else. It could be the download that I had, maybe the version I had, maybe I had some bad versions. I don't know. But the velocity levels were not importing correctly for some instruments. So I would play the instrument on my keyboard and I'd hear nothing. I'd look at it, everything's fine. And then come to find out that there was no assigned velocity for, say, velocities 0 through 40 or 0 through 100 or from 100 to 127. It was very strange. So after I figured that out, I just knew where to check and fix it. But that was something to be aware of. And then the last thing, and this really did bug me a lot, was unnecessary looping of instruments. Like instruments that don't have infinite sustain, and then they have sustain built into the sound, like a glockenspiel or a pizzicato string note. Like those don't have a whole lot of sustain, period. And for some reason you hold the note down and you have this infinite sustain. And so I went through and kind of corrected that as I went. Just something to be aware of if you're using the St. James Orchestra. But overall, I had never used this before. I was very pleased with it. Squidfont. I can't say enough about how much I love the Squidfont orchestral sound font. Get a lot of articulations for your instruments, has a great sound. It does have kind of a baked in ambient reverb to it, but it's not so much that you can't work around it. There are some tuning issues in some of the low brass instruments. In most things, you can go in and fix those after the fact. You can edit, and Reason you can edit the tuning if you need to. And then there are some, I only think of them as useless string combos, because you've got multiple string combos that I use them because I was kind of just trying to use everything right at the end of that piece. But it was like, here's all your violins, but it's only in legato, and here's a violin and a viola, but it's only in legato, and here's a cello and violin or something. So it was interesting, but I didn't see the point to having those. They're kind of just taking up space. But anyways, I mean, I think sound speaks for itself on that one. VSCO, so VERSILLIAN Studios Chamber Orchestra. And I had never used this before writing the piece with it. And it is called a chamber orchestra for a reason. It is clearly intended for chamber music. It doesn't pull off like that, the big sound. I kind of tried to do the same with each one of these pieces. I tried to do kind of here's a big sound. Here's what it sounds like when you got all the instruments playing. And that kind of reminded me of like a junior high school band. There's a lot of solo instruments instead of sections. So it sounds great for chamber, but
it didn't come off as warm and full. It sounded kind of hollow. And I should mention I'm using the Big Cat version of VSCO. It's a VST, so I'm using multiple instances of the VST, and it allows for key switching between notes. And so pretty easy to use. It's a lot like using a Kontakt instrument. But anyways. So it's good for chamber stuff, and although I will say the strings in it are great. I love the solo strings, the pizzicato especially. That was my favorite section of that. That was a pleasant surprise, and you kind of just have to explore it. There's a lot of percussion. There are some unique percussion sounds that you don't get in other places, so that was really neat. And I tried to take advantage of those in the piece that I wrote for it.
So, a quick word about Alpine. This was the last one that I worked on, and is a little bit different than the rest of them. You do have to have Kontakt to be able to use it. So, I guess it's kind of a gray area in terms of, is it free? But I guess none of this is free exactly, because you're going to have some sort of DAW anyway to do any of this stuff. So the Alpine project combines elements from multiple different sound fonts and sound sources, some that were included in other libraries that I've made examples of here, some that were not. So originally it was not going to be part of this video, but after I thought about it, I decided I better go ahead and include it, because we just needed to have a good roundabout way of doing it. But Alpine, good things about it. Sound quality is very intimate, and you can kind of tell just from listening to that. And your ears are the final decider. But so some intimate sounds. I recognize some of the samples from other free libraries that are in this, from the St. James Orchestra. I recognize some of those same samples. I recognize some of them from the VSCO library as well. And so they've tried to take the best of all worlds. You can use the modulation wheel on some of the sounds, and like you can get some overblowing on trombones, I think, and get some timbre changes through the use of the modulation wheel. So it does have that power packed into it. It is excellent for solo instruments. So the VSCO is chamber orchestra, and this is even a notch up from that, which it uses some of the same samples, but as a package, it's put together a little bit better. Occasionally, there's some uneven volume levels where things got a little strange here and there, but that was minor. I don't think I'd complain about it too much. I wish it had more articulation options on the wind instruments, or really on everything. But you know what? It's also free, so I can't complain about it too much at all, because it is still very playable and very usable. I was very pleased with the final product of the piece that I created with it. Kind of a Philip Glass inspired last half of it. I thought that came out great. I thought it sounded great. So altogether, I mean, you can decide for yourself which one you like the most. The Alpine project was easily one of my favorites. It did take a little bit more work to get to that sound. For Squidfont, you just kind of drop it in and go. You get your different articulations, and it seemed to me it's the easiest. St. James Orchestra has its strengths and weaknesses. So final takeaways. St. James Orchestra has some good sounds, has a couple of elements that you don't have anywhere else, like choir, and overall was one of the most well-rounded. The Squidfont Orchestral Sound Font is still one of my favorites for ensemble orchestral sounds. Has great ensemble sounds, and you don't have to do a whole lot of work with it. You drop them in, you mess with your velocities and go. VSCO, VERSILLIAN Studios Chamber Orchestra, is a little bit more work and is a chamber orchestra, so I do feel like it is good it's like an icing on the cake thing. Standalone, I wasn't wild about it, but I did not try building my own ensembles and sections with it, and that might bring a whole nother aspect to it. If you put 5 violins together or 3 trombones, or you build a section, you might end up with a completely different sound where you get those solo instruments turn into a section, and those sections turn into an orchestra. So that might be a topic for another video in the future. And Alpine was my favorite. Again, a lot of solo instruments, but the solo instruments just gelled much better together, I felt like. So all of these have their own strengths and weaknesses. It's all free, so all it takes is hard drive space and time to download. So you have nothing to lose by trying them out yourself. But I hope in listening to these, and listening to me jabber on, that this has helped you a little bit in figuring out what's going to be the best solution for you. And if you have any suggestions or anything else that you would like to see and hear in a future video, then please let me know, because I am open to all kinds of suggestions and avenues. And if there's something that you want to see, hey, what if you do A plus B plus C, and how does that come out? Yeah, just let me know. Put it in a comment. So please like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Thanks for taking the time to listen, and see you next time. Cheers.